Morning.
Morning.
A dilemma. We are told to trust our instincts, and for good reasons. We often learn from our experiences what is good and what is not good to do. And we see things in a certain light that we have learned often the hard way on how we should do things. And so trusting our instincts, it's often a good thing to do. But what happens when our instincts, which is based on our experience and also based on how we're reading or seeing a situation, mislead us? Because this also can be the case. We are often inclined to judge people by what we can see and what we think we know about them from what we see. And this is, in some ways, this isn't bad. Like if I was telling my kids and they're driving down and they see a hitchhiker, and I would say to them, you know, if you see someone by a side of a car and that has a flat tire and they have a child and they're waving you down, stop. But if you see a hitchhiker and you're driving by and they're wearing a mask and they're swinging a baseball bat, don't stop, right? It's that sort of, the situation implies certain things, and you need to have a certain wisdom. But what happens when we get it wrong? What happens when you stop and the woman who's waving you is obvious bait and they steal your car? And the guy who's wearing a mask is because, you know, maybe he had a childhood accident and he's waving a bat because he's trying to get attention. It's the only thing he has. We make assumptions based on what we see, and it's not that we aren't need to do that in our lives. It's just we have to always be aware that we're making assumptions. We have to be aware that we are guessing or thinking we know things about people that we do not, and we just simply are grasping whatever we can to make these decisions. When we first moved here, I remember one time I was driving to Sussex. I think this was, we'd been here like 2 years. There was a car pulled over on the side of the road on the highway to Sussex. And so I pulled over to help. And it's only as I pull over that I realize it's 3 young guys with full neck and face tattoos. And they are looking, they were under the hood of their car. So I pull up, I get out, I look up. They get out from behind their hood and I'm going like, huh. And I say, you guys have, do you need help? And they're like, yeah, it won't run. I said, okay. They said, well, it was overheating, so we poured water into the engine to try to cool it off. And I looked and I said, you mean in the radiator? They said, no, well, we opened this part, and they poured water where you pour the oil. And I said, this car isn't going anywhere. They're like, oh, we just bought it last night for $200. And I'm like, yeah. But these 3 guys with full facial neck tattoos and not the most knowledgeable in either financial transactions or cars, I ended up giving them a ride all the way to St. John because, like I said, they weren't going anywhere. And the one guy I'm riding with, I was saying, yeah, I'm kind of new to the area, I'm from Manitoba. He goes, oh, I've been in Manitoba. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, Stony Mountain, which is the penitentiary in Manitoba. So we talked about that for a while. And I realized, as this was before I had any connections at all with the prison, but I realized I was grateful that I didn't see them before I stopped. Because I made, well, some of the assumptions were correct, but I drew the wrong conclusions from those assumptions. We see people and we think we know them, and we guess about them things that we have no right to guess. Or, worse yet, we value them in ways that we should never ever value someone. It's the same thing when people come here to the church, and if they are kind of a little, perhaps not dressed the best way, perhaps look like they've maybe been sleeping in a parking lot, and they come at the back, I'm going to be thinking right away, after this service, they're going to ask me for some money. And if someone comes in and they've drove a nice car and they're well dressed and stuff, I'm going to think, no, these people aren't going to ask me for money. But so what? If the person is poor and they need money, should I not be grateful for the opportunity to be able to help them, that they've come to the church? And And if I make assumptions on the character of people, how do I know that the people who are driving the nice car, in the words of James, didn't take their neighbors to court and get rich off of a lawsuit, and that's why they're driving a new car? How do I know who someone is by how they dress or what money they have? We fall into this trap. And it's hard to avoid because society keeps telling us the value of people based on the value of things that they have. And in our whole media, how much do we get to hear about rich and famous people, about all their actions because it makes news, because we think that we need to hear about the rich and famous people all the time because, well, don't we want to? Whereas, don't we not want to hear about the poor? About the people on the streets? Isn't it easier for us to ignore them? And we fall into this trap because we are constantly told this message over and over and over. And it's not just, we can't just blame this on society. We can't just say, well, that's society, but we're different. When I was on the board for a religious institution, one of the main topics that often came up, and it's not MCC, but but one of the main topics that came up all the time was donors and how do we get more money. And one of the things I said naively in my youth, this was back in Manitoba, and I said something about saying, well, you know, we have all of these, okay, I'm giving it away, alumni. It was CMU. And I said, we have all these alumni, you know, shouldn't we be sending stuff out and trying to expand our base of donors and connect to all of our... And they looked at me like I had a second head and they said, no, Gord, that's not how you raise funds. You go after the rich. You find a few people and you spend all your time and energy because, you know, we can have 200 donors that might give us $100, or we can get that one guy and maybe we can get, you know, $1 million from him. It's far more beneficial to go after the rich. And fine, they're trying to raise money, I understand. But then when they started to talk about programming for the university, they were saying, well, you know, what are programs that we think rich people would want to donate to? And so they were talking about leadership programs because the rich love to use. And I'm like, why are we doing this? Why are we focusing on just the rich? I understand the need for money, but you know, if we can't expand, we can't expand. I'd rather us be faithful with what we have than try to be, you know, glamorous and sell part of who we are. The value of a person is not in their wealth. And that's what James is telling us. Someone comes in through the door, doesn't matter what they're wearing. You know, if they're wearing a mink coat and you're offended, or they're wearing rags and you are slightly disgusted, it does not matter because the value of that person who has come in is a child of God. And how do we learn to get past our own biases, our own sort of innate ability to say, well, you know, I know who that person is just by what we see. And again, it is prevalent because if it's not wealth, then it's other things that we base them on. Somebody recently, when I was in the chapel in prison, somebody made a statement about, you know, they had had this interaction with their wife, and then somebody else said, yeah, women sure like to complain. And I'm like, women? I said, and you guys still complain all the time in my office? So this is only a woman? Well, okay, and men as well. I'm saying, like, yes. But we find the little things that we're able to say, this is this group and that is that group, ignoring the fact that, you know, to quote, I rewatched a little segment from Life of Brian, but we're all individuals and we are all filled with all sorts of our own unique aspects. And yeah, sure, maybe some of us do something. I realize, and this has come home to me in a way that I cannot avoid it, but I realize I get away with stuff because I am an old white man. I go into places, like into the prison, and I can get away with stuff because they look at me and they're like, you know, they assume that I have a certain amount of authority because I'll say, well, I need to do this. Oh, okay, sure. Well, what do you need? Whereas my other colleagues who aren't old white men will get pushback. Well, why do you think you need that? Or who told you you can? Whereas they'll simply assume that if I'm saying it, I can get it. People make assumptions about me, and if you know me, you know that those assumptions are wrong. They're thinking that I'm wise and organized and I have it all together, and I don't. But if I pretend, they're willing to accept it. We make assumptions about people that we should not, and James gets after us for that. James says, how dare you? Because if you're doing that, you have it all wrong. It's not about the wealth. It's not about how we look or what we've done. It's about the fact that we're the children of God. And if we can't see that, then we've missed it. And then our faith needs a lot more work. We get seduced by things, by the love of money, and we perceive the value of people by how many things they have accumulated. But we often fail to see the simple value in every single person that we meet. Every single person has value. And the trick is, how do we get past our own biases? I have the privilege of working in the prison, and for me it is disturbing when I come across people who say, well, inmates, and they'll cast this vast net on all inmates. And I know people, the three gentlemen we have here are, and I hate to say this in their hearing, but are excellent people who I trust, respect, and cherish. Okay, now you have to forget that I ever said that. But people have assumptions against inmates simply because, well, they've committed a crime, they've been in prison, they can't be any good. And we can say, yeah, but I kind of get how people might get that, depending on what their experience is. And yet just this week, someone was talking to me and saying, yeah, so-and-so has real issues with anyone who's a religious leader, who has parts in a church because they had a very negative experience with faith. And so for them, all religious people are cast in the same net. And I can't say to them, wow, that's dumb. It might be, but I can also understand why someone's had a negative experience in a church, has been cast aside, has been judged. And so they see all people in the church doing that. So it actually does not matter what group we are in. Inmates, church, male, female, white, black. People will always find ways to make assumptions about us based on one or two things and completely miss it. And the thing that James gets after us is that we too often use money as that thing that we value people on. We look at them and we say, they have that, that gives them worth, or that does not give them worth. We need to see people as valuable. And we need to see people as valuable irregardless of what we may think about them. And this is the other part that James then gets after us. Because he says, we're all transgressors. Like, you might look at someone and you might say, they have done, the example that James uses, you can say, well, that person's never committed adultery, but they murdered someone, so they're a transgressor of the law. He says, but as soon as you've broken the law, we're all transgressors of the law. We've all broken it. And so we are all then needing mercy. So he says, no matter who you look at someone that needs the same mercy that you need. And if you can't give them mercy, well, he says, then you won't get any mercy, which kind of harsh, but that's what James says. Because for those who give no mercy will receive no mercy, but those who give mercy, mercy triumphs justice. Meaning that even though we have all failed, even though we've all transgressed against the law, we get to rely on that mercy of God, just like we get to share that mercy of God with the people that we meet. And if we can't see them needing mercy, then how can we expect mercy for ourselves? People matter. And no matter what they have done, they have value because they have been made in the image of God. And God cares for them still. For those people who go through all those horrendous things, we see people on the news and we can say, look at that person, what they've done. But inside that person is a broken person that God still loves and cherishes and desires healing and wholeness for. So if we only see the one aspect and fail to see the child of God in that person, then why should people see it in us? People matter, and how we treat them matters. The story from Jesus is probably one of those passages I struggle with the most, because Jesus is kind of harsh for the woman. But you have to try to, you don't have to, but if you're putting it into context, so Jesus has gone off to an area that's not a Jewish. He's gone to Tyre, and that's a Gentile area. And everything that we've read about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is that everywhere Jesus goes, he's being hounded by people. Everyone is asking him things, and every time he tries to get off on his own, the people find him. And Jesus is getting burnt out. Jesus is having all this all the time, and so he's trying to actually, for whatever reason, it seems like he goes to Tyre to just kind of get away, to have some moments to himself, because he needs it. So he's gone to a non-Jewish area where hopefully they won't notice him, and he can just kind of blend in, and he can just catch his breath. And so he goes into this house where people notice. And this woman who's not even Jewish, who so shouldn't even know about Jesus, but somehow does, comes to him and says, "Hey, I got a problem, you have to fix it." And Jesus is like, "Look, my mission is to care for the Jewish people." And it's not that Jesus only cares for the Jewish people. If you read through the whole Bible, you understand that the Jewish people are a light to the world, and it's through the Jewish history that we learn how God is caring and loving, and that's the story for everyone. But Jesus is part of that right now, and Jesus is trying to take care of the Jewish people so that they can be a light to the world. It's kind of like, I'm doing this to grow this, and I'm overwhelmed with what I'm just doing. And so Jesus is kind of like, "Look, I'm taking care of the children." He uses the word dogs, which is harsh, but she just doesn't bat an eye. And she goes, "Yeah, but shouldn't even the dogs get crumbs?" And the strength that she has to confront Jesus in this way is amazing. And whereas other people would look at this Jewish woman, this Gentile woman, and write her off, she's the wrong faith, we don't know anything else about her, but they've already made assumptions, and she shows a strength in faith that Jesus says, "Your child is healed." It's one of those passages that at first when I read it, I struggle, but then as I think about it more and more, it reminds me and instills in me that whole aspect that God is moved by our requests and our prayers. Not always in ways that, it's not like it's a one for one, every time you ask, you get, but here, Jesus had his plan, he had his agenda, he knew what he was doing. This woman comes and he disrupts it for her because she asked. And it reminds me that we are called to ask. But it also shows me that all people have value. And even when you don't have time, you don't have energy. I'm not saying burn yourselves out. I'm not saying put aside all your own. We have to love ourselves as we love others. But make sure that when you love those others, you're not only loving some of those others, that you're loving all of those others. And make sure that we aren't drawing lines that makes it easier for us just because that's what's convenient. We're all transgressors, we're all broken, and we all have value. And we have to remember that that value rests in the people as opposed to the things that we think matter more. We get caught up in the rings of gold and the clothes that people wear. But it's the people themselves. Brad loved the land that his family had owned for 4 generations. His great-grandparents had moved, when there was a little village down in the valley, they'd moved up into the top of the hill and they had made a farmstead for themselves there, and it was beautiful. The view that you got from the top of that hill was wondrous. And they ran it as a farm for a while, and then his grandparents, his grandfather grew up on that farm and ran it as a farm for a while, but eventually his grandparents, when his dad was born and had been there for a few years, they moved down into the village, which was now actually a bustling town, because the farmstead didn't really have enough to make it go. But they kept the land, and they kept their own the shed that had been there, and they kind of turned it into a nice little cabin. And the family would go back up there, and Brad and his brother Josh and their parents would go up there pretty much every weekend. And it's the place that if you ask Brad what he imagined heaven would be like, it was that little section of land. Because he could remember going there with his parents, and he remembered his dad taking him to the creek and to the pond and fishing, and they would, he knew every square inch of that land. And that bustling town was now almost a little city, and the value of that land that they now owned was considerable, but no way would Brad ever sell it. Because this was the land where he grew up, where his best memories of his mom and his dad was on this property. And he and his brother still, even after his parents passed away, they would go up there on this land once a year. They would take a week camping trip, just the two brothers, and they would go there and they'd spend time. But they would also bring their families there. And Josh had a wife and he had 2 kids, and their kids kind of grew up on that land. And Brad always looked at Josh as an amateur because he'd only been married once, but Brad had been married 3 times, and he brought all his wives up there. And in the end, if they asked him what was really important, he'd always say his land. And so none of the 3 marriages lasted, but the land did. And he loved that land. And he knew that Josh loved the land too. It's what they had from their history. It was their identity. It's how he thought about his parents, especially his dad, when they'd sit around the campfire. So Brad was in shock when Josh approached him and asked him about the possibility of maybe selling the land. Because Brad and Josh owned it in partnership. And he was shocked, Brad was shocked, but he kind of saw this coming because Josh was going through a hard time. Josh's wife just had cancer, and it was now the 3rd year of her fighting cancer, and she hadn't been able to work, and the medical costs were going up and up and up, and Josh's 2 kids were just at that university age, and he was struggling now with just one job to pay for the mortgage and the house and his wife's treatment, and the idea of his kids going to university. And they were trying to get aid, but they couldn't get a lot of aid, and Josh was sinking. He was going down fast. But the idea of selling that land to Brad meant selling your family, in a sense. This was how he knew who he was, because of this land. And when Josh said, "Brad, do you think maybe?" And Brad looked at him and said, This is our great-grandparents' land. This is our grandparents' land. This is mom and dad. This is us. This is to be your kids too. I understand you have needs right now, but we can't throw away our history on some immediate need. Like, think of how important this land is to us, to me, to you. Josh goes, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. I know. I'm sorry." And Josh felt bad that he had asked Brad, and he just said, "I won't bring it up again." Brad was shaken. And that weekend, he grabbed his tent and he drove up to the land, and he camped out by his favorite campsite that he had there, and he pitched his tent. It was close to the creek, and he had a fire, and he stayed up late, just watching the fire burn, thinking. And then he went to bed. He knew right away it was a dream, because while his dad was sitting at the campfire, and his dad was dead, so this probably was a dream. And his dad looked up and said, and he caught Brad's eye, and he looked up to the stars and he said, "It is a beautiful night." Brad goes, yeah. And Dad looked at Brad and says, I love this place. This was my favorite place to be. As a kid, as an adult, he says, I just loved coming up here. The campfire, the stars. Brad goes, I know. It's my favorite place. I love being here. And his dad says, and I loved bringing you and Josh here. He said, but you know what the best thing was? Brad goes, what? The creek, the pond, the fishing, the sky, the fire. His dad says, no, the best thing was just seeing you and Brad together here. Seeing you grow up here, seeing how close you were, seeing you value each other. Because that's what I think about now. Brad woke up and his tent was dark and the fire was out. But he knew. Packed up his tent, it was dark, but he knew his way through that land. Went down to his car, drove to Josh's place, got there just in time for breakfast, and Josh was opened the door at like 6:30 in the morning. Brad came in, huge smile, and Josh hadn't had a good night's sleep because he didn't have those anymore. And Brad walked in with some pancakes from the IHOP and coffee and laid it out to him and says, he goes, looks like, Josh, you need a breakfast. Josh goes, yeah, that's great. I don't have a lot of time. I have to go to work. He goes, yep. No, I just wanted to have a cup of coffee with you and some blueberry pancakes. And I just wanted to say that tomorrow you and I should find a realtor. Because more important than the land is you. We get caught up. We see things and we think somehow that they're important. I think one of the things that I am blessed by my time in prison, sorry, I don't mean that as a disrespect.
We know what you mean.
Thank you. Is because I see them and that when they talk about what matters the most, it's not their cars or their trucks or their houses. It's the people. And I'm reminded of how important people are. And that's what James is telling us. He's telling us people are important. So if they are important, then his last part of that passage is, if they're important to you, then do something about it. The words aren't enough. It's not enough to simply say, yeah, you know what? I cherish you, hope you have a great day, and then you do nothing about it. If we cherish people and we care about people, then let our actions follow our words. Or let our actions lead our words. But don't let it just be words. Because if it is words without actions, then it is empty. This week, look at the people in your lives. Those who are close, those who are distant, but see the value in them, and then find some way to follow up so that they know that you value them.